we carry forward the conversation around human rights. Sport was, and will always be a powerful tool to highlight the imbalances in society. The case of Hakeem Araibi stands as one of the landmark movements that saw sports rise above and beyond the corners of the playing field. Now, no two people were closer or more important to the Araibi incident than the two gentlemen I will invite upon stage. But before I do, a short video on Hakeem Araibi.
All the people here, all the Australian people, all the media, they support me, and I just want to thank the Australian government, Australian people. I want to thank this man. He's quite too much for my case, and I want to thank him too much. And I thank the media, all the human rights, and thank you. And I will be more strong for this country. And yeah, I will be strong here just for Australia. And Australia, this is my country. This really, I didn't citizenship yet, but my country is Australia. I will be there in Australia, and I love Australia. Thank you very much.
Welcome home, Hakeem!
We were really concerned that anything we said or did could be counterproductive to seeing what we've seen today, which is a young Australian. A young Australian reunited with his wife. I'm very proud of Australia. I'm very proud today to be Australian. I think what's occurred over the last almost 3 months to fight incredibly hard for not just a young player who virtually no one knew, but a refugee who was under our protection and who we felt that all of us needed to step forward and protect. To see him back here on home soil today speaks volumes about the character, the values, and the pride that we have as Australians.
I think that deserves a round of applause. What you saw in that short video does not even cover the tip of the iceberg that was the Hakeem Araibi case. And to help us genuinely get an understanding of how deep and how impactful and what a landmark case this was, I'd like to invite two gentlemen who couldn't be closer to this story. May I invite Craig Foster, former Sacros captain, commentator and athletes' rights activist, and Mr. Brendan Schwab, Executive Director of the World Players Association.
All right, thank you. Where would you like us?
As comfortable as you can be. It's going to be a intense session.
All right.
Hello.
Thank you.
So Nandan was supremely kind enough to give me this session. I didn't have to fight him for it. So just a quick background into the case. I'm not going to go into too many details, but I'll just give you an overview for those of you who don't know about the case. Hakeem Araibi is a naturalized Australian footballer who was born in Bahrain. He played professional football in Bahrain. In 2012, he was arrested in the middle of the street in Bahrain on the allegation that he had vandalized a police station. He was jailed and tortured for 3 months, but then eventually released on bail. In 2014, 2 years after the Arab Spring protests in the Middle East, while on a playing tour, he found out that his brother and some acquaintances were deemed guilty on the vandalization and arrested. Hakeem knew he was innocent as he had been playing a live televised game at the time of the alleged attack. He knew that going back home would mean certain jail time for him. He chose to run, eventually landing up in Australia. Late last year, however, his life took a dramatic turn. Just as he landed in Thailand on a honeymoon with his wife, he was arrested on arrival. Why? The Bahraini government alerted the Interpol and issued a red notice on the same vandalization charge against Araibi. At first, this seemed like another isolated case of human rights violation. Over the following several weeks, however, what unfolded was a whirlwind of events that turned the Araibi's case into one of the defining moments of sports and human rights history. The case received worldwide coverage and shook governments into action. Eventually, through the efforts of dozens of individuals, Araibi was freed and returned to Australia, where he was bestowed a citizenship. The two gentlemen on stage with me, Craig Foster and Brendan Schwab, were in the eye of the storm that was the Araibi case. They were two among the key personnel that kept the wheels turning, which is really important in a case like this, and ensured that Araibi got justice as soon as possible and became a free man. Welcome, Craig. Welcome, Brendan.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Jonathan.
There are very few stages I feel small and insignificant as on this stage. And I'm going to start off, Craig, by asking you the question. Human rights violations, as we discussed the whole day today, are, sadly, they are commonplace. Why do you think this case exploded the way it did?
Right. Okay. Well, firstly, thank you everyone for the invitation to be here. It's an absolute pleasure. I might just also address the video quickly before we go. The reason I was making all those comments about Australia is because one of the answers to that question is because this case had far greater implications beyond just a refugee on a protected visa who happened to be from Bahrain who was detained in Thailand. It was about sport coming to the table through the FIFA human rights policy. It was about the broader Australian community and sport governance coming out and fulfilling their obligations to just one player, but as a proxy for all those whose human rights are being breached within sport. Thirdly, we felt it was an important case because it was about the human rights of people being breached outside of sport. And sport, as you said before, has a social, not just responsibility, but an incredible power to articulate these really important social issues. And Brendan talked about the nuance and the difficult discussions. Well, we're having some of those in Australia at the moment, like many countries around the world. And our concept of asylum seeking, something that we're very comfortable with in football, being the multicultural game in Australia, is a very challenging discussion, highly politicised debate in Australia right now. And Hakeem came into that, was detained within this overall context. And what I was saying there was not that, Australia is the most incredible thing, because we have our own human rights issues. The point I was making was to Australia to say, if we can step forward and do this for Hakeem, then why can we not do it for every other refugee and asylum seeker in the country? And why can't we take leadership as a nation on this issue and try and at least be a better global citizen and, in fact, hopefully show some leadership to the world? Because other countries around the world now are taking a lead from the often heinous way that we're doing this at a diplomatic government level. That's the context for that. The answer to your question is because sport has power to change society. And we became involved. I became involved because I was asked and I knew that it was necessary that a former player step forward. So in what was a very complex case, one of the big themes was the power and the responsibility of former athletes to protect the current generation. And at what lengths are we going to go to do that? And as a former chairman of our Players Association, our player union in Australia, which Brendan, a 30-year friend of mine, is the current chair and also multiple times. And we come out of this field of collectivism and the power of athletes to have a voice. And when we have confronted governing bodies, and I heard the doctor earlier today talking about IAAF and the bubble and how they make these decisions, that's essentially been, we understand that very well. I was a former professional player and we know where they're coming from. And therefore, this kid needed us. He needed players. He needed athletes. And in so doing, our part in hope, aside from just trying to free the kid, was that we could demonstrate to our current generation of our sport and former athletes across all sports that this is an important field. We would like you to do likewise. And we believe that we've been given a life by sport and you have to step forward and help Caster Semenya and others. Like I say, where's all the athletes then? Where's all her brethren, female and male? Where are they saying? So, as Brendan rightly said earlier, if that case, Castamania, had happened in any form within our sport now, there would be a very different prospect for the governing body to deal with this mass of athletes around the world saying, well, you breach her rights, you breach ours. And just finally, can I just say, you said we're advocating for justice for Hakeem. Actually, we haven't found it yet, because Hakeem was a part of almost 156 athletes who was incarcerated and many alleged tortured back in the Arab Spring period. And both FIFA and the IOC, and I might say our governing athletes, our governing players body globally, which is called FIFA, have all failed to ensure that there's been a thorough investigation into the treatment of both he and others in one of the most grievous treatment of athletes en masse anywhere recently, and equally those in governance who failed and were unwilling to uphold their own FIFA human rights policy as yet have not been held to account. And this brilliant lawyer will now explain to you why.
So Brendan, Craig's done my job for me. He's thrown it to you. Why do you feel federations, associations, and governments initially chose to stay out of this? If you read the reporting, a lot of them said, they'll take a hands-off approach. But eventually, as the case was moving towards resolution, they almost did a 180 turn. Why do you think this was the case?
Well, the main federation that acted that way was the Asian Football Confederation. And of course, the president of the Asian Football Confederation was Sheikh Salman, a Bahraini, a member of the Bahraini ruling family. And when the Australian president of Football Federation Australia approached him about saving Hakeem, his answer was, no, this is a political matter, and we have to keep politics and sport separate. That was in, I think, early January at the Asian Cup. Hakeem was detained in late November. So that goes to show how little action there had been. But of course, human rights are not a matter of politics. And in fact, I like the statement of the Commonwealth Games Federation, which is trying to create a safe space for athlete activism at its events, to say we're not politicising the games, we're humanising them. But FIFA had acted earlier because it has made human rights commitments. It hadn't acted with the power and the leverage that we felt were necessary because, but it had at least issued a statement, and this is important to this case, was this is a black and white human rights abuse case. This is refouling, that's the term, or refoulement is the term, under the Refugees Convention and the Torture Convention. It's one of the most significant breaches of international law for a nation state to send a refugee who's been granted asylum in another country, which Hakeem had in Australia, back to the country which had tortured and detained him. And as Craig was saying, the reason, like, he wasn't just a player, he was also a human rights defender. He was a part of the group of athletes that participated in the pro-democracy protests in 11/12 in Bahrain. Now, the reason the sports governing bodies did not get away with that inactivity was because there was a movement in place. The sport and human rights movement that we'd been building since about 2015. At World Players, we coordinate what's called the Sport and Rights Alliance, which includes organisations like Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, the International Trade Union Confederation. And we'd been able to negotiate a number of important human rights commitments, including the FIFA human rights policy, together with many other actors. It's important we're not taking sole credit for this. And a new host city contract for the Olympic Games, for example. So even the IOC was stepping up to the mark in some respects. So from our point of view, Hakeem was a unique person for the reasons I've just mentioned. Plus, in 2016, he spoke out against the candidacy of Sheikh Salman for the presidency of FIFA. And he spoke out when he was in asylum in Australia to the New York Times. And remember, the presidency of FIFA is a vote of all the countries. It's not the Confederation. So 208, I think, is the number. They all have a vote. And Salman lost to Infantino by about 3 or 4 votes in the first round when Hakeem had made his human rights treatment an issue in the election. So the view of the sport and human rights movement was that if a Bahraini who's a senior vice president of FIFA and a president of the AFC can refoul a football player who's a human rights defender, and FIFA also has a human rights defenders policy now, if they could do that under the eyes of the international community, then everything we are fighting for to embed human rights in sport is worthless.
So, Craig, taking off from that, you've played professionally, you've represented the country. I'm somebody who believes that if a system is broken, instead of pointing out it's broken, let's fix it. And I think, all three of us come from the same school of thought. Do sports governing bodies have a responsibility towards ensuring protecting athletes in the face of human rights violation, especially when, for example, they are traveling for international duty? And if so, how can they play a more active role?
Well, I would ask the opposite question: is how can they possibly say that they don't have that obligation? Firstly, and the power of this movement that Brendan has been so central to over recent years is that this awarding of a major sporting event is starting. The awarding of major sporting events has started to and will continue to and accelerate to have a very strong human rights component. And so take, for instance, there's now a movement that started only in recent weeks around Beijing 2022, the Winter Olympics. And if you consider what is occurring in the northwest of that country in relation to the Uyghur population, it's extraordinary human rights issue globally now that all of the major human rights organisations are extremely concerned about. And there's going to be a very interesting case because now I think for the first time IOC are going to be placed under the similar pressure that FIFA were placed when the World Cup was granted to Qatar. And you had issues around labour rights and the kafala system in particular. And what's most interesting about it is that these are not necessarily players. These are the impacts of having the World Cup in that country. And whereas Hakeem was a very straightforward case because he is a registered player in the second division. He's a participant of the game and a former national under-23 player from Bahrain. So the pressure is coming, as Brendan said earlier, from the human rights community, increasingly from the athletes themselves, through the sponsors and directly to the governing bodies. And as more organisations globally, I think, see also what happened with Hakeem, you find that these associations, for instance, of this particular ethnic group situated in this area of, with a particular religious bent, whatever that may be, they now recognise that a significant point of leverage on the human rights of their people is a major sporting event to be prospectively held in their country. That's the power of sport. When used effectively, we believe, and certainly I do, that sport can have a much broader positive impact on the human rights of people globally.
May I get another mic?
Craig tends to blow the mics.
They love him. It's very, very clear. So, Brendan, like as Craig mentioned, this isn't about when we speak about human rights violations in terms of sport, it isn't only about the athletes or the people who are directly connected. It's about the impact that larger communities have with the sporting events that go. That takes me on to my next question, which is, in general, we all believe sport is supposed to be neutral to all. However, in the case of, for example, the 2014 Russian Winter Olympics, where Russia battled with LGBTQ issues, whether it's Iran's ban on female spectators in stadiums, and something that's been a highlight over the past couple of conversations, which is Qatar's human rights violations in terms of labors. So, how do sports federations who, for example, like FIFA, who signed up with these human rights panels, how do they work with local governments who have their own human rights violations? No government is perfect. That's something we know. Like Craig admitted, Australia, as forward as it is, it has its own issues. So how do sporting organizations like FIFA, who already have human rights in place, work with local governments to ensure that we're at least on the same page on learning and implementing human rights issues?
Well, this is a sports law conference, and so we have lawyers here. And what I would encourage everyone to do is to really get to understand the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, what we call the UNGPs. Because this framework was established in 2011 by a brilliant man named Professor John Ruggie from Harvard University, who was appointed by Kofi Annan to look at the question of business and human rights on behalf of the UN. And without this framework existing, I think it would have been impossible for the myriad of stakeholders involved in the sport and human rights issue to come up with a framework themselves in order to approach these complex matters. So the short answer is that the states that you're dealing with have a duty to protect internationally recognised human rights, and business has a duty to respect them, which means using its leverage to ensure that human rights are respected and upheld. And the examples you used are really good ones. And of course, sport as a business, and FIFA as a business, the Indian Football Federation here locally is a business for the purposes of the UNGPs. It's not just transnational businesses. Sport has unique powers of leverage. And so if we look at the situation with the anti-gay propaganda law in Russia, that was really one of the first issues that galvanised organisations like Human Rights Watch to be a strong, to get proactive in their approach with the Sport and Rights Alliance to ensuring that, if any event should be inclusive and welcoming and safe, it's got to be a mega sporting event of a global nature. And FIFA had to be very strong on that when the World Cup went to Russia in 2018. The other example you used is the ban on women entering Stadia in Iran. For me, that's a no-brainer. Like, FIFA has a statute that prohibits discrimination. It's not mandatory law in Iran. Many people think it is, but it's not. And so I believe that FIFA could easily say, and actually has an obligation to say, which Gianni Infantino did in a letter quite recently after many years of lobbying, that he should say to the Iranian Football Federation that unless you allow women to enter the stadia, you will be excluded from the competitions. And that may well happen with the World Cup qualifiers just around the corner. That's a good example of the leverage that sport has. With Hakeem's case, probably the issue that caused the most tension in our dealings with the IOC and in particular FIFA was that we called for sporting sanctions if Bahrain Football Association, Bahrain Olympic Committee and the same bodies in Thailand, if they failed to exercise the requisite leverage over their respective governments in order to prevent the refoulement of the player. There's strong opposition to that. Fatma Samura is strongly opposed to sanctions on human rights grounds. But as you know, and James Kitching used an example yesterday, they were very happy to terminate or suspend Indonesia over an internal fight over the governance of football. But when a person's life is at stake, well, no, it's separate. And that's going to be one of the real areas of debate moving forward, is when can we encroach in this area of sanctions, something Craig and I lobbied for very passionately, but so far ineffectively.
Moving slightly on terms of, taking a slightly different tangent. Craig, the past 10 years have seen a significant, and significance is a very small word, a significant amount of investment from countries that have questionable human rights records, right? We don't even need to go into the list of countries. It's all over the place. I'd like to quote something from Amnesty International Gulf researcher Devin Kenny. And, these are his words which he said to the Guardian. These are brazen attempts to sports wash a country's deeply tarnished image through the glamour of the game. Now, sports washing is, for those who aren't aware of it, sports washing is a term that is coined by, again, like I said, countries with questionable human rights records who are investing in sport and then kind of cleaning the image of their country, or rather hiding some of the issues under a carpet. There are two schools of thought here, and I'll ask this question to both of you. I'll start with Craig. One is they say money invested in sport is good for the sport. It helps the sport grow, but there are others who oppose it, saying, well, the source of the money ought to be clear, and if it's starting from a place where there are human rights violations, we have an issue. Question is this conversation so black and white, or is there a middle ground, and what's the balance to be attained?
Yeah, it's a difficult conversation actually, because there is very few absolutes when it comes to human rights, and every country has some concerns, that's for sure. However, by even participating in sport, particularly at the global level, there must surely be a fundamental standard as to how that country acts and how they treat all of its people, particularly in and through that sport, that's for sure. And there's a widening understanding from both the business community and the athletic community, and I think the fan base. And that was one of the really important parts of the Hakeem campaign, was that fans got on board. And what we saw was from a global football fan base, a great frustration with precisely that point, on this sense of loss of values, this over-corporatisation and lack of protection of people within the game, in lieu of this huge amount of money that's coming out of wherever it is in the world, and it's coming from many, many regions. So there's two theories, I think, and Brendan will have something to say about this, is where Qatar was an interesting example where social change has been developed by virtue of having been granted the World Cup. And there must, though, be a certain standard by which a country cannot be granted a World Cup, and certainly can be stripped of hosting rights. And so what the community of Uyghurs globally now are, I think, rightly saying is, under what circumstances should China be able to host Beijing 2022 at the same time as this, allegedly around or in excess of 1 million people are being detained under these circumstances which are abusing their human rights? So the governing bodies are having to now confront what is a difficult question, but we think an incredibly important question when it comes to players, when it comes to even fans, when it comes to governing bodies and people within the sport. It's reasonably straightforward. I would love to see sport used in that manner, use its social power to be able to embed greater protections, greater respect for fundamental, internationally recognised human rights of all people globally, in order for your country to be able to participate as a global member of any of these major sports.
Brendan, how, as a lawyer, one of the things that I was talking to a bunch of lawyers, and I saying one of the things that fascinate me about lawyers is you have to almost keep your personal bias aside and look at the facts and try and find the right balance between what's right and what's wrong. How do you balance this issue? How do you balance this conundrum?
Well, I disagree with what the premise of the question, really, about what it means to practice law. I practice law because I think it's a powerful vehicle through which we can bring about change and have a positive impact for people. And that's why I practice law, and I think you should bring your passion to it, and it is a cause. And I hope everyone who thinks that you can't take your personality away from it. You see, in terms of the actual issue that you asked Craig about, the situation in China is very difficult because people don't have a voice. Okay. It's a country that doesn't recognise freedom of expression or freedom of association. They're the two most important enabling rights: freedom of expression and freedom of association. Okay, they're not recognised in China. So when China hosts a mega sporting event of global renown, then that's an opportunity for the human rights activists to highlight an issue in a way which is safe, and in markets which are all of a sudden interested in the issue, and those markets recognise the right of freedom of association and freedom of expression. So the reality is, for the sports governing bodies, If you're going to go into an area which has a problematic human rights record, then you have to be ready, willing and able to deal with this issue. Because the human rights community, civil society, which includes lots of lawyers who are activists, right, they're going to be looking for that opportunity to highlight and demonstrate the injustice and try and bring about an outcome. And sport historically has been able to say, well, sport and politics doesn't mix. It's a ridiculous comment, as we well know. The other point, though, on sports washing is this, and one of the great achievements of the sport and human rights movement was in 2018, we set up under the presidency of Mary Robinson, the former president of Ireland, the former UN Human Rights Commissioner, the Centre for Sport and Human Rights. And its job is to ensure that human rights are embedded within the world of sport. And it has what's called the sporting chance principles, which are the guiding principles about which it's going to go about its work. As you would expect, they embed the UNGPs, they uphold the UNGPs. But one of the key principles is that the right to host these events should be open to all. So we take an inclusive approach. Now, that means that some countries are going to, and human rights criteria are now part of the bidding requirements, and that's something we've done a lot of work on with the IOC, FIFA, UEFA in particular. Human rights requirements are now part of the bidding process. So the answer to your question is, can the human rights impacts, issues be managed? They're going to be there. Even, as Craig said about Australia, they will certainly be there in Australia's bid for the 2023 FIFA Women's World Cup. It won't just be the sports washing regimes that you've mentioned. Every country will have them. But there will come that time where the risk may be too great that it cannot be managed. And it's going to be interesting when we get to that stage. As to what the decision is made. UEFA nearly found itself in this situation. It put human rights criteria into the bid for the first time for the 2024, I think that's the cycle, and they had one bid from Germany and another bid from Turkey, right? And so the question would be, and they were nervous about how that would be perceived. In the end, the bid went to Germany. But that was a very clear situation that had the bid gone to Turkey, then the human rights plan that Turkey would have had in place would need to be incredibly robust and would require the state to act in ways which would be difficult in the current circumstances.
Last question for the two of you. Brendan, I'll start with you. If we try and break down the case of Araibi's case, there are just way too many checkpoints and just way too many peaks. Personally for you, what was one of the highlights or maybe even an anecdote that stood out during the journey of this case?
Well, look, the guy's next to me, but his leadership was incredible. And getting on the ground in Thailand, getting the intelligence from government about how to do. Craig was able to earn greater trust in the sports governing bodies in the end where the governments are at. Because when you're campaigning at a public level, as the video showed, you've got to be very careful that the message you're sending is not counterproductive. This isn't about getting a player paid or an employee, which is my historic expertise. If you get that wrong, this is a man's life, and he's got a wife and he's got family back at home in Bahrain. So the stakes were incredibly high. But at the end of it, I was very flat. I don't know how you felt, Craig. We haven't really discussed it, but I felt very flat. And I think the reason is this. As I explained earlier, Hakeem was a unique victim, and he was able to galvanise the world. But most victims of human rights abuse are silent. They don't have a voice. And so therefore, they're dependent on the system we're trying to build. And the system didn't do enough to save Hakeem. And so therefore the system won't protect those who don't have a voice. And that's part of the reason why we're so committed to building this system, so that we can rely on it to uphold the rights of everyone who's involved or impacted by sport.
Craig, something that was a highlight or maybe even a fun story that not fun. First of all, it was not fun. Let me take back those words. Something that stood out, whether it's an anecdote or a highlight during the entire course, because it was a crazy journey, to say the least.
Yeah, just on that point before, can I just raise one question? The thing about this Turkey-Germany that you're talking about there is very similar to China 2022. And my question would be, and everyone will have a different answer at the moment, but I think this is going to come out in the next 5 or the next decade, is what is the value of China being granted those rights and then being challenged on their current human rights issues with the Uyghurs? What would be the value of Qatar being granted and then the human rights community making sure that the sports are held accountable to it? What would be the value in Turkey of the European Championship being granted there and then being measured against that? Because what we find through sport is what we found with Hakeem, is that sport allows us to have discussions and to give a voice to all of the refugees in Australia who currently are having their rights compromised. And they're not in sport. So one of the great criticisms that we faced during the campaign, me personally in particular, was, well, you know, I was an Amnesty refugee ambassador. I worked with a range of organisation in social causes over a 20-year period. But this was different. This was in front of Australia. This was in front of the world. And many people in the refugee community were rightly saying, well, you're fighting like anything for Hakeem. Why aren't you fighting for all of us over here? And that was a great challenge for us. And I said to them, you're right. You are right. I'm obligated in sport, but please just bear with us, because what we do is when we get Hakeem out, we're going to use that case for all of you. And when we use it for all of you, we hope to use it for the refugees and displaced people around the world, which is increasing drastically, including with, the current climate crisis. That's the power of sport. That, for me, was the greatest thing out of what was an incredibly challenging, life-changing, and in many ways horrifying campaign, to find out how countries treat people like Hakeem, to find out what we are fighting around the world. But in the end, it showed what sport can do. Sport, football, then the broader sports environment engaged everyone. It moved our own Prime Minister to act. The day that I went to see Hakeem on the second occasion around his hearing, around the 4th, it was on the 5th of February, only a week before he got out. And I went to see him, and the Australian Prime Minister called me 10 minutes before. I think he saw on Twitter that I was going, right? And they called to say, I'll let him know that, I'm thinking about him. And I was able to go in to a Bahraini, Muslim, protected refugee living in Australia, and I was able to look him in the face behind the perspex and say to him, Hakeem, the Prime Minister of my country has given you all his support and he's fighting for you. So is Didier Drogba. Yeah. Thank you. So is Didier Drogba. So is Giorgio Chiellini. So is Brendan Schwab. With the 85,000 professional athletes worldwide are fighting for you. Our foreign minister is fighting. Our prime minister is now fighting. We have sport, we have civil society, we have sports fans, and we have sport around the world. That's the power of human rights when we embed them in sport.
Thank you. Nandan, we have time for questions. Any questions? I'm sure there are a bunch. Can we get a mic to the gentleman in grey, 4th row from the front, from the back? Could you please introduce yourself and be specific on who you're asking the question to?
Hi, I'm Ishwar. My questions to either one of the, specifically to Brendan, is that when these human rights requirements are embedded into the sporting contracts, what the nation federations, what's exactly the requirement they are taking? Is it a mere declaration by the federation or the bidder for these sporting contracts which are saying that we will fulfill human rights violations? Or is it someone going to check later at some point of time that these requirements are being complied with? Because a mere declaration would then just be turned into a paper promise. That's the problem, I think, that needs to be solved. So what are your comments on that?
It's a great question. And that's when I say we still have to improve the system. So the starting point is the constitution of the sport. FIFA has its constitutions called the statutes, and it's made a statutory commitment to human rights. And then in furtherance of that, it's adopted a number of policies. The most important is the FIFA Human Rights Policy, and I recommend you read that. And that sets out the requirements under the UN GPs. And really there's 4 steps that each sports governing body has to go through, and the policy is the first. The second is to act proactively and do what we call a human rights due diligence. And that's to be proactively aware of the impact of the activities and the relationships that the business has on the rights of people. So if we look at the case we spoke about earlier with Castor, there was a lot of research about the performance enhancing effect, but there was little research about what it actually meant to participate in the program that was being prescribed. And it wasn't until after the CAS decision that the World Medical Association issued its statement. Now, a good due diligence would involve sitting down with the World Medical Association in the developmental phase. The third step's about remedy. And this is where we have a really big problem. And even FIFA and UEFA, which have done the most in the Commonwealth Games, we still need to build a grievance mechanism so that athletes or anyone who's impacted by sport can access an effective remedy. Part of the reason why the women are still out of the Stadia in Iran is they can't trigger a process to get in. And so we have to build that grievance mechanism. And it's not the CAS because they don't have standing. And as we discussed in the earlier panel, the CAS isn't human rights compliant anyway. And Professor Ruggie has told FIFA that. And then the fourth step is engagement with stakeholders, not this unilateral imposition down. And around that, you have to build some governance mechanisms. So FIFA, for example, has an independent human rights advisory board. It makes recommendations to FIFA, and it publicly reports on FIFA's progress in implementing those recommendations. And so there's an accountability there through transparency, and transparency is essential.
Any other questions? To this gentleman in the suit right in the front here.
So I have 2 questions. They're just really short ones, though.
Let's do it one by one, yeah?
It doesn't mean the answers will be.
Yeah.
So ask your question, Sean.
Yeah. So my first question is, sports washing exists in owning clubs as well, not just in organizing events. Like Qatar owns couple of clubs, Saudis own Man City, etc. So in such a case...
Emiratis,
sorry. So in such a case, would you recommend, why doesn't the FA have rules similar to the German Football Association or the Swedish Football Association, where the player union, where the fan unions own more than 50% of the club? So at no point is it the property of a foreign investor.
Okay. Greg, would you like to go further?
Well, I think there's many models of ownership, and some of those models might be more conducive to it, but in my view, it's more about the understanding of the athletes and the game itself. And the game is not governing bodies. The game is the people who play it and the people who support it. That's what we believe. And when those people recognise the power that they have, the clubs will move irrespective of the ownership model. And that is an ownership model that I particularly like, I must say, and that we've explored in our own professional competition in Australia. But that's not the only solution. The solution is people understanding what their rights are, understanding what the benchmarks that they have to abide by, and people stepping forward in that respect. At the moment, that is going to largely have to be the athletes, because the public, and what we saw in Hakeem is, and what we know is that the public and the fans of sport, the people who are supporting the sponsors, who are supporting and upholding those clubs, irrespective of their ownership model, those people follow the athletes. They don't follow the CEO, or they don't follow the chairman. They're not on the field playing. So the athletes, when they understand their power and they are responsible and hold their own sport and game responsible to these minimum standards for everyone else, then the game shifts. And athletes, we think anyway, understand it intuitively, because we compete against each other. There is a solidarity between all of us, whether that's in football or elsewhere. That's why I would challenge, and I would like to see athletes in other sports, and whether that's in the Olympic movement or in athletics, in all of these things, asking themselves, what obligation, responsibility do we have towards our fellow competitors? Because it's everything. In the end, the game will change because the clubs will change through the pressure. And you've seen that with FIFA and all other bodies. One of the corollaries of all of this huge corporatisation, this massive money that's coming into global sport now, and even in international football, they're talking about new properties. We want to go to 48 teams in the World Cup, and we're talking about another $400 million. Everything is about money, and it's no longer about the athletes. It's no longer about the people actually playing. I noticed you had the panel on data science and protection of data and ownership of data. We were having this discussion recently at a national level in Australia, only in the past week, and the athletes are completely removed from that environment. In my view, they need to take back their power. The athletes and the fans, if they take the power of any of these sports, then the governing bodies well understand that their authority or their legitimacy is significantly in question.
So before you ask your second question, I would like to see if there's any other questions, because otherwise I'll make this the last question. Okay, so since you had one question, give it to the gentleman behind you. Please introduce yourself and ask your question.
Hi, my name is Ashwin, and just a quick disclaimer, I don't really come from a law background. So my question is to both of the panels really. So how would the entire scenario with human rights as it pertains to athletes play out with minor athletes? So especially for global youth events like your Youth Olympic Games in that context. So what does the policy and regulation say for that?
Well, there's a very important international instrument called the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child. And what we look at, a lot of the policies around children have not been developed with that approach in mind. If we look at football, for example, football's provision on the protection of minors provides that young players can't transfer up until the age of 18 if they're from outside of Europe. That would have denied Harry Kewell a career. Harry Kewell's a famous Australian player who is one of the players we're most proud of as Australian PFA members. How's that in keeping with his rights? And so the answer is to really go through those 4 steps that I mentioned in answer to the earlier question, with child rights experts and an acute understanding of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, so that these decisions are made in the best interests of the child, not in the best interests of the sport. And sport's in a crisis at the moment, and the 2 biggest crises, there's been many, but for me, Qatar was a tipping point, clearly, in terms of our movement. And in terms of the athletes, the tipping point is what's happened in the United States with the gymnastics. I'm a board member of the Equality League, which is fighting for safe sport and gender equality and gender equity in sport. And the IOC likes to describe itself as the supreme governing body of the Olympic movement. So therefore, it has leverage over the US Olympic Committee, and it has leverage over US gymnastics. And unfortunately, instead of that leverage being exercised to protect and uphold the rights of those children and women, the US Olympic Committee, using sports lawyers, took the approach of deny, deny, deny. And as a consequence of that, we had uncovered sexual abuse, which has gone to the legitimacy of US gymnastics to the extent that it's been declared bankrupt. And the US Olympic Committee is now in the centre of a congressional hearing, which will see a major rewrite of the statute which governs it. So Craig, in answer to the previous question, used the word legitimacy. That's what will happen if sports don't act in this way. They will lose their legitimacy or their social licence. What we have to do as sports lawyers and as activists is to act proactively to make sure that sport's doing the right things. It's a win-win for sport. But I just do want you as sports lawyers to think through the ethical implications of autonomy and protecting sports governing bodies if that's giving rise to harm. and I just put that out there as a reflection point.
One point I might just make on that as well is there was a gentleman up here who I really enjoyed listening to. He was advocate of the Supreme Court. Is that correct?
Right. Sanish Dayal.
Okay. And he made an interesting comment around human rights. And did he say it would be cool or something? It'd be nice if they were cool.
It should become hip and trendy.
Right, okay. And what I reflected on at that moment is, well, that's what sport is, you see. That's what sport is. Sport and music and other things, that's exactly what they are. And so by reflecting the human rights discussion, whether it's youth or otherwise, or gender equality, and of course you may know under Brendan's leadership and our Players Association in Australia now are advocating globally for equality of prize money under FIFA's own statutes, arguing for those to be upheld. But through sport, the discussion changes, and it changes around human rights, and it changes around the treatment of children, and it goes from the regulations and why to human rights and why not. That is, and it puts the athlete or the participant at the heart of the discussion, and that's where we believe the starting point is.
Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Brendan. I think these two gentlemen deserve a huge round of applause. May I request Sharda Ogra to please come up and give our guests mementos?
And with your indulgence, Jonathan, I know we're not dress code compliant, and then we had to wear the shirt of our favourite football club. Well, I've brought one, and I'd like Nandan to come up if that's okay, because his hospitality's been unbelievable, and I'll ask Craig to present it. But this is the shirt of the Pascoe Vale Football Club. That's Hakeem Araibi's club, and it's signed by Hakeem Araibi.
Thank you.
I think that's an incredible gesture.